So welcome. This video is going to go through how we break down that first level of classification that we introduced in the last video. We're going to break down the system of the kingdoms and how many kingdoms we have, which are 5. Again, lots of words in this video. If you want to start writing down a glossary, write down a glossary as we go. And if you lose any or you misplace them or you miss some, the best thing about this is that you can pause, rewind, and watch it again. In addition to that, you can also refer to the Quizlet. All of the big words or all of the words of the kingdoms and the features within them, they're all on that Quizlet as well. Let's get started. So let's start by talking about early classification methods. So Aristotle, who was an ancient philosopher, he grouped everything into 2 simple groups. He said, you're either an animal or you're a plant. And we went, okay, we can do that. He said, you're an animal if you have blood, and you're a plant if you have no blood. That's it. They're your 2 different systems. Now, you might start to be thinking, are there things that aren't animals and aren't plants? Okay. Do you have different ways of looking at this system? That's fine. So the next thing that he did after he decided if they were an animal or a plant, so he'd take the group of animals and he'd go, do they have live young? So did they give birth to a live animal, or do they lay an egg? And that would be the next way he would classify them. And then he would go through that key, breaking it up all the way down, just like you did with your key, and came up with his own classification system. But over time, they realised that some plants weren't really plants at all. So they thought, we're going to make a new kingdom. We're going to say there are plants that can't make their own food. So some plants can make their own food and some plants can't. So they created this new kingdom, and that new kingdom was called the kingdom fungi. So now we have 3 kingdoms. So we have the animals, the plants, and the fungi, which are your mushrooms and your yeasts. Then we go down one more level, and they go, okay, now we've got technology. So we keep going through time, and eventually they developed microscopes. So once they developed these microscopes and they invented them, they discovered that there were actually these tiny little microorganisms, or micro meaning small organisms that existed all on their own, like these pictures here. So these pictures here are showing you some of those single-celled organisms. Some of them were a bit like an animal, some of them were a bit like a plant, and some had aspects of both animals and plants. And they went, hang on, that doesn't fit. They're not an animal, they're not a plant, they're not a fungus, so they made another kingdom. And this next kingdom was called the kingdom Protista, or the protists. Finally, the microscope kept getting better and better, and as the microscope got better and better, we zoomed in further and further and further. And eventually we started to discover that some single-celled organisms were completely different from others. So some of them didn't have a nucleus. Now, nucleus is this kind of big blobby bit in the middle, and some of them didn't have that big blob in the middle that was filled with DNA. And because of that, they said, we're not done yet. We're going to add our 5th kingdom, and this one we call Kingdom of Monera, or sometimes we call them Kingdom Prokaryote, which is what I'm going to have in the slides in a second. And these are bacteria. So we now know that all organisms, actually, the bacteria are a huge group of organisms. So we can't just say there are bacteria, protists, plants, animals, and fungus, but we actually even classify a couple of these bacteria as different from each other. So we have what we call 3 domains. Now, we're not going to be testing you on 3 domains. We're only going to be testing you on 5 kingdoms. So I'll get you to help with that in a second. And that's what your next mini task is going to be, is to summarize the 5 kingdoms that we tell you to. So you can organize things into 3 domains. You can have bacteria, this group called archaea, which I'm not going to focus on because it's very subtle differences between them and the bacteria. And then eukarya, which is where we live as an animal. You can see us as animals right up here. So we've got animals are part of the kingdom eukarya, whereas over here you've got these archaea, and these bacteria. So just looking here, I would like you to pause and I'd like you to draw up a little table, or at the end of this you can pause on the final slide and you can write them all in. But essentially you've got 5 different kingdoms that we want you to learn, and your next mini task is going to be creating a visual organizer to show this information. So the first kingdom is the animal kingdom. What makes them an animal is the fact that they need to eat to survive. Now the word for that is actually called a heterotroph. So that means we are heterotrophic because we can't make our own food and we have to eat to survive. There's also another important feature. We are multicellular. What does that mean? Multi meaning many, cellular meaning cells. So these are all animals are heterotrophic, so they have to eat to survive, and they are multicellular. They're the 2 important words you have to have next to animal. The next one down is the plants. So plants are special because plants can actually make their own food. Yeah, and the fact that plants can make their own food, that makes them not a heterotroph, but actually what we call an autotroph. So to troph, the troph bit there means to feed. Okay, so these guys can feed themselves. That's pretty cool. And they're made up of many cells as well. So these guys, sorry that's not written in there, they are also multicellular. Pretty cool. Yeah, and this is stuff like grass, gum trees, moss, any of the plants out in your backyard that you might see. The next group, or the next kingdom that we talk about, are the fungi. And this is that first one that kind of didn't fit in the animals or plants. So these guys don't feed themselves. They don't need to necessarily eat to survive, but they actually feed on dead material from other living things. So they eat dead things. And that has a very specific word, and that's called a saprophyte. You can be made up of many cells, or sometimes they can also be a single cell. But that's what you get as a definition of a fungus. The second and the last kingdom are the protists. Now these guys are, sorry to have that misspelled, very importantly they are single-celled. They have one cell. What the word for that is they are unicellular. So things like algae, protozoa, you can have these things called an amoeba or a paramecium. They are known as protists. The very last kingdom that we want you to learn about or to summarize in your books are the prokaryotes. So what are the prokaryotes? They are very, very simple organisms. They don't have what we call a nucleus, which can be easily seen under a microscope, so we can't see that in them. And so therefore they are single-celled and they are very microscopic with no nucleus. All these guys up here, all these ones, the animals, plants, fungi and protists, they all have a nucleus. So the fact that these guys don't have a nucleus, that makes them special. So here is a table for you to copy. You can also find, or you can pause it on here, and when you're drawing your table, you can incorporate some of this information. You can go off and do other research as well. But that is my bit on the 5 kingdoms.